Before we get into this chapter, one thing you have to remember is this is in the context of the book of 1 Corinthians, and it is in the context of what we just read about in chapter 6. In chapter 6, Paul had just finished talking to the Corinthians about immorality, sexual immorality specifically, and the damage that does to a person and to the body of Christ when they're having sex outside of marriage. We then come to chapter 7. Now, I want to prep you for this by first off saying this is probably going to be the strangest sermon you've ever heard in a church. It's certainly the strangest sermon I've ever preached. And if you have heard stranger sermons, I question what churches you may have been going to. But the thing I want to bring up here is that these verses, when I said we're going to go through a book of the Bible at a time, I'm going to take whatever topic comes up in that book. I'm not going to skip something because we just don't talk about that or something else. These verses are talking about sex. And that's something that we rarely talk about I was going to say we rarely talk about it in church. That's not true. We talk about it all the time. Don't do this. Don't do that. Don't do that. And those are good things. You're right. We should not be having sex outside of marriage. We should not be committing adultery. We should not be having homosexual acts. But the point is, almost always sex is portrayed in a very negative way in the church. But yet there are portions of the Bible that portray it very, very differently. And we're going to talk about that today. One of the things that I remember, and I probably told you this before, but if I haven't, it's quick, it's worth repeating. I was about 6 years old, and I walked into my father and I said, "Dad, what does sex mean?" And I will never forget his answer. His answer was, "Don't say that. That's a dirty word." And all I could think was, wow, how am I supposed to answer the form when they say M or F? But my point is that I didn't have any idea what the word meant. I'd seen it on a form. But even without that, think about the response. It's a dirty word. No, it's not. There's nothing dirty about that word at all. It is misused frequently. Matter of fact, if you look at the world today, it's probably misused more than it's used properly. But it's not a dirty word, and it's something that God created. Now, this chapter starts talking about, not about marriages explicitly, but about singleness to start with. And it says, "Now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman." Does not sound at first like it's going to be the most positive speech on marriage. It turns into that. But the first thing I want you to notice, it says, "Now concerning things about which you wrote." Most likely what's happened here is the Corinthians, we know there was a missing letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. Most likely the Corinthians sent back a response to Paul. And Paul is taking a look at this and saying, "Wait a second, guys, you got this wrong. You don't understand it." So what we're seeing here in chapter 7 is Paul's response to what the Corinthians had asked about. Now, what has to be seen and understood here is if you understand the Corinthians saw sex in a very black and white manner. In other words, it was either everything goes or nothing goes. Remember, the problem in chapter 6 is they're going out, they're having sex with prostitutes, they're having sex outside of marriage, they're doing all kinds of things, and Paul is saying that is wrong. But then you obviously had this other group we can read from here which was saying, wait a second, okay, if that's immoral, then we got to stay away from it completely and no sex. But they were including in marriage. And I think the reason this chapter 7 starts this way is to say, wait a second, guys, you don't understand this. There's something you're missing here. I've just told you what you can't do, but you also need to understand what is appropriate. Now let's talk about singleness for a minute, because it talks about it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Remember, first off, that's not a blanket endorsement of no one getting married. What that's saying is, in light of what you've just asked about not touching a woman, period, yeah, that's good and it's ideal if you can stay single, but it's not meant for married people. Now, one of the confusing things here is, why would people want to stay single? Well, let me say this. If you are single, you probably have more opportunities to serve the Lord than if you are married in many ways. Certainly more time. Let's face it, when you get married, there's time commitments. There's time commitments to your spouse. If you have children, there's time commitments to that. I know I was probably not nearly as concerned about houses and furniture and everything else until I got married. Not only that, if you look at the historical context here, the historical context is within about 3 to 4 years, Nero was going to go nuts. And at that point in time, Christians were going to have to be fleeing and be persecuted. They were already being persecuted some by the Jews at this point in time, but the Romans were going to take on that persecution. If you are fleeing from someone, it's easier to get up and run through the woods or through the desert or the jungle or whatever and get away from people if you're one person fleeing than if you're trying to take your wife and your family and your grandkids and your grandparents. I mean, you see what I'm saying? It's a practical thing. Paul's not saying this because it's just the wonderful thing to do. He's saying from a practical standpoint, it's easier. In history more recently, you can see it. When people fled Nazi Germany, when people fled communist countries, it was easier for a single guy to get away from them. So the reason for not marrying here in verse 7 he's talking about, in verse 1 rather, it's practical so you can flee persecution, but also because it does leave you with more time. I know I didn't get married until I was 35 years old. What you learn when you're single for that long is that you have a lot of time on your hands. And a lot of times you can fill that time with doing things for the church. But you do have a lot more time than when you're married. Now, in addition to that, if we continue reading in verse 2, it says, "But because of immoralities, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband." One of the things we have to clear up here to start with, it says, when it says in verse 1, "It is good for a man not to touch a woman." That's not talking about hand-holding. In the original language, at that point in time, it would have been clear to anyone reading it, he's talking about sexual relations. So that's the topic he's talking about here. But when it comes to single people should not have sex. That's what he's saying. If you're single, no. Now, that creates a problem, though, for some people, because if you're single and you desire not only sex, but intimacy and marriage, what do? And what Paul is saying is, if you can manage to be single and handle it, great, you got more time on your hands. If you can't, get married. Don't be immoral. Get married instead. One of the things I would say is, if you burn sexually, get married. And it's because of the immorality spoken of specifically in chapter 6, verses 18 through 20. Now, it's funny. One of the things that I would say is in the church, I've seen this over and over in many churches. If you're a single guy or a single woman, especially a single guy, and you come to a new church, the first thing the church looks at you is almost like you're some kind of a predator coming in to find prey. And I've seen it over and over, and if you've ever been in a singles group, you know what I'm talking about. He's just here to find a woman, okay? Now, I'm not suggesting that, we go to a church just because of the women or something. But I'm also suggesting often in churches, we take the wrong attitude by seeing as it's wrong because a single Christian guy is looking for a single Christian girl. That's what he should be doing. What do we want him to do? Go to a bar and pick up a girl or something like that? It's almost like sometimes churches will force people out of the church to find their mates. And that's not what God intended here. Because there is a very positive side to this. If you also note in verse 2, it talks about each man and each woman having his own wife and own husband. It's not saying be promiscuous, it's saying married, but only with your own, or sex within marriage and only with your own spouses. In addition to that, I would also caution you, if the only reason you're looking for a spouse is for sex, then there's some other issues we should discuss as well. But it is a part of it that you can't separate from marriage. Now I want to talk for a moment about what I call the gift of singleness. If you don't have what I'm calling the gift of singleness, you're probably better off not being single. Admittedly, sometimes it's not by choice, but for example, I said I got married when I was 35. I was ready to be married when I was 20. None of the women in the world that I knew were ready to marry me at 20, but I was ready. But the point is that if you have the opportunity and you find the right person, be married. I had a friend one time, 25 years ago now, and he said to me, he finally came to the conclusion he had the gift of singleness and he was going to stay single for the rest of his life. And I said, really? That's wonderful. I said, so you don't burn sexually? Oh yeah, I can hardly sleep at night or think about it because it's so bad. Okay. So you don't feel a need to be with someone for your life. You'll be content without a wife. No, I really need intimacy and everything else. What I finally confronted him with is, you don't have the gift of singleness, you have the gift of fear of women. There's a big difference. And within a year, he ended up being very happily married to the woman that he was longing for, who was longing for him also, but was ready to leave because she couldn't get him to ever ask her out on a date. My point is this: there is a gift of singleness, and there are people that I have known and have met that are completely content without a partner. If you have that, great. It gives you abilities to serve God in ways that married people can't serve. By the same token, if you don't have that gift, you're just going to be wasting your time, and you're going to be led into immorality. And God doesn't want that. It's better to marry than to be single and burn, is what he was saying. Now I want to talk for a minute about the blessings of marriage, but I also want to talk about the failings of the church when it comes to talking about sex. When I was in 3rd grade and when I was in 6th grade, I had what they called one-day sex education classes. Kind of a misnomer, because they really didn't teach us anything. They just made us curious enough to figure out what we didn't understand. And what I found was there was absolutely no moral foundation whatsoever when it was taught. Nothing. It was, here are the mechanics. They could have been talking about rebuilding a transmission instead of sex, and it would have been the same thing, because there's no moral connection at all. It's just, how do you get the job done? And again, we were so confused anyway, we couldn't understand what was going on anyhow. But absolutely no values to it. Now, here's the thing. If you think about it, churches frequently over the years have screamed because they want to teach sex education in schools. And I really don't think schools are a good place because of the lack of values. But the problem is, we don't take on the responsibility as churches on our own. We should be able to talk to children and tell them, not in detail, but hey, there are things coming up that are wonderful that you need to know about, and you need to keep yourself pure until that day. I'm not worried if the kids know about the details of how to have sex, but the point being is that we ought to be teaching them that it is a wonderful, positive thing within marriage. And all we usually do is emphasize the negative. And I'm not saying there aren't negative, obviously. There are negative aspects. But frequently that's what we do. If you look through history and look at what the church has taught, some of the false views, even still today is taught. Number one, sex is only for procreation, especially in the Catholic Church. If you're not procreating, if you're not trying to have kids, you can't have sex. And not only that, in some cases, you can do it, but you're not allowed to enjoy it. I've actually heard Catholics talk about that. And frankly, sometimes that spills into non-Catholics too. I've had a lot of friends who are Baptists and other denominations as well, who felt somehow that they had to feel guilty if they were going to have sex with their wife or their husband. All it does is take away all the intimacy if you talk about procreation only. That was never the way God intended it, and we're going to see that in a few minutes here. Another thing that's a false view is it's a necessary obligation. And these verses coming up will kind of reinforce that if taken out of context. In context, we're going to see that's not what it's talking about. But that it's something that it's got to be done in marriage, so let's just get it over with. Again, a horrible false view that completely destroys what sex is about in marriage. I personally know a couple that used to brag about the fact that until the day they died, they had never seen each other naked. And they were married for, I don't know how long, 50 years or more. Never seen each other naked. They had 3 children and had never seen each other naked. And they thought this was something to brag about for their purity. That's not what God intended. We're going to see in the Garden of Eden in a little bit, that's exactly the opposite of what God intended. Another false view that's put out there. Not only that, another view that we often hear is, you've got to stay a virgin until you're married, and we should. But if you cross the line and you're not a virgin, it's all over, you're ruined, and that's the end of it. Frequently, people are taught to be so guilty in marriage because of what you did before marriage, and that's not what the Bible's teaching. The Bible is teaching, yes, we should stay pure, but it's also teaching there's forgiveness if we're not. And marriage is the ideal setting to have intimate sex with your partner, with your spouse. The truth is, if you look in the Bible, something that most people don't realize, do you realize that there actually are no prohibitions within married sex? Now, number one, I would recommend don't harm each other, and number two, it should be consensual. But there's nothing in the Bible that says what you can and can't do if you're married. There's a lot of prohibitions if you're not married, but if you're married, it's up to you. Enjoy each other. That's the positive aspect of sex that we just don't talk about in the church. And the other thing also is again, we rail sometimes against sex ed in school, yet we don't train people in the church. If married couples or people who are getting married need information or are having troubles in their marriage with their sexual relationship, they should be able to come to people in the church who are either older, wiser, or elders or whatever, and talk to them and get help. That is the function of the church. God wants the family to be strong, and that's a portion of it. Now again, we rarely talk about sex here, and normally we don't have such open conversations. But sometimes when it's hitting it in the text, we've got to do this and talk about it. Not only that, the family should be training the children. And again, not so much the mechanics until they're married, but just in what's coming up and the wonderfulness of it. It shouldn't be for schools. You know, I remember one time sitting in a restaurant and having a phone call come in from a newly married couple, from the woman. And she was calling her mother-in-law, not her mother, interestingly enough, and literally saying, we've been married for 36 hours, and we are totally lost and don't know what we're doing and can't figure things out. You know something? I thought that was great. Because the woman was able to open up to her mother-in-law, and her mother-in-law helped her, and they have a very happy marriage now. But the point is, the training should be within the church. The training should be, if you have sexual questions, you should be able to go to your parents or go to the church and not have someone say to you, no, sex is a dirty word. It's not a dirty word. Within its proper place, it's wonderful. And it's God intended as well. Now, when we get to verse 3 and 4, 3 and 4 starts to get a little more dicey as far as what we're going to talk about, because it says, let the husband fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her body, but the husband does, and likewise also the husband does not have authority over his body, but the wife does. What is Paul talking about? Is Paul actually talking about couples sexually satisfying themselves in marriage? Yes, he is. It's exactly what he's talking about. If you look at the word literally when it says here about fulfill his duty to the wife, it literally in the original language says pay the debt. That's kind of a weird way of putting it, isn't it? To understand this, you need to understand the context. Remember, the context is the Corinthians writing and saying, hey guys, what's going on? Should we abstain from sex and marriage? And the point being is he's saying no. And he's phrasing it in a way that I don't think he would phrase it were it not for that. Obviously, there should be love. There should be intimacy. But the point being is, he's saying pay the debt. This is something that is normal, that this should be a part of marriage, and if it's missing, there's something wrong. Apparently what was happening is the Corinthians thought you should be abstinent, you should practice abstinence in marriage. That certainly wasn't what Paul was talking about. He's talking about pleasing each other sexually, and he's talking about that as an act of love, and he's talking about that as a privilege. But it is something that if it's missing, there's a problem. If we continue looking at these verses about the wife not having authority over her body, one of the things that's kind of confusing here is, and the man not either, some people take this as, see, the guy can do anything he wants and say anything he wants. No, if you look, first off, it's mutual. Each other. Control of each other's bodies. It means find ways to please each other if you're married. I've had married people talk to me before, and sometimes just come for counseling and talk. And you know what I find out in some cases? They're really afraid to please their partner. To them, it's just something that's got to be done. And even if they enjoy it, they don't really think of ways to find it. I think what this is saying is, try to find ways to please your partner even more if you're married. You know, the other thing too I was going to say is, prior to being married, I had more time on my hands. After I was married, I'm more productive. If you're designed for marriage, you will not succeed if you stay single. And part of it here is finding ways to please each other. Now, there's something else I have to say here because it's a misunderstanding that happens quite a bit. This is not when it says, you have the authority over your wife's body, she has the authority over your body, that is not a license to demand sex. I know of one preacher who used to preach, when you're married, there's no such thing as a headache. Yes, there is. There's headaches, there's flus, there's stress, there's a lot of things. Anyone who would take, as a husband or a wife, especially as a husband, who would say to his wife, it's your duty, and you've got to do it, period, because it's your duty, he doesn't understand what love is. He doesn't understand what kindness is. He doesn't understand what tenderness is. The point being is, it's not simply there saying, hey, you can force the person to do what you want. That's not what it's saying. But what it is saying is, married couples should be loving to each other. Now, when we come to this also, we got to say, why is Paul even discussing this stuff? If we get to verse 5, we suddenly see why he's discussing it. In verse 5 it says, stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, that ye may devote yourselves to prayer, and come together again, lest Satan tempt you because of your lack of self-control. The reason for married couples to please each other sexually is because otherwise Satan will tempt, and not that Satan won't tempt anyway, but it makes it easier for Satan to tempt married couples. Sexual temptation has probably destroyed more churches than anything else I can think of. I can't even count the number of pastors and church leaders that have fallen and had to leave the ministry because they fell to sexual temptation. Not only that, frequently, if it's the pastor, it destroys the church. And not only that, it destroys the family. The family unit is the basis for what God has established. He builds churches from families. When this happens, you end up destroying the trust, you end up destroying the testimony, you end up destroying the family and the church and the individual. Satan is looking for that. Satan is trying to destroy marriages like that. Now, this also doesn't mean just because people are sexually satisfied that the marriage can't go wrong. No, there are some people, it doesn't matter how good things are, there are some people who are just going to go wrong. But what it is saying is, when a couple is sexually satisfying each other in marriage, it is very difficult for Satan to pull that marriage apart. And when I say Satan, I mean the satanic kingdom, okay? But the point being, it's very difficult for them to pull that marriage apart. Intimacy is enhanced by great sex. And not only that, if you don't have sex and you're not intimate with each other, what you're going to find is other issues are going to pop up. Resentment, anger, etc. Now again, normally this is something you don't think we should talk about in churches in most cases. If you have complaints, send them to Gene and Randy. But this is, when we ignore this, we're setting the church up and setting the family up for failure. It's that critical. In addition to that, something I have to make clear here, which is obvious to most, if you have a happy marriage, you're going to understand this. Sex is never the basis of a marriage. But it absolutely strengthens and enhances a marriage. One of the things that I find is if sex is the basis for a marriage, people feel used. That's not what we're looking for. But as far as having to be there, one of the things that I think about is, I enjoy cooking quite a bit. And I try to cook somewhat fancy at times. One of the things I enjoy cooking is filet mignons with a cast iron pan. And when I do that, I have a system set up where, number one, before I ever put the steak into the pan, the pan goes into the oven at 500 degrees for quite a while. And it has a special oil on it that has an incredibly high smoke point, flaxseed oil, so that I can put that pan in the oven at 500 degrees and it's not going to smoke. When that pan comes out of the oven, it's ready for the steak. And again, I use the cast iron so I can do that with it. Cast iron doesn't care whether you got it in an oven or a flame or anything else. Bring it out, put the steak on it. Sometimes I'll use a second pan so that when I flip the steaks, I can get another sear on the sides of the steaks. Those steaks are good, but they're not great. You know what makes those steaks great? It's what I do in the end with the steaks. It's when I have a special red wine butter sauce that I make. And not only dip the steaks in it, but have that for pouring over the steaks in the end. That steak goes from great steak to steak that I don't want to say you'd kill for, but it's pretty close, okay? It's the same way with marriage. You can have a good marriage without good sex. But great sex will enhance the marriage, enhance the intimacy, will take away resentments, will do a lot of things. And the point is, it comes from loving each other. It's not just the physical. For one thing, if you're thinking about sex just as a physical act, you're missing a lot of stuff. It starts before you ever get into bed with each other. But it's the same way with the filet mignon. It's that final sauce that caps it off. However, if you were to take that sauce and drink that sauce by itself, it wouldn't be very good. It kind of make you nauseous, I think, by itself. It'd be so rich you couldn't handle it. Well, just like marriage. Sex can't be the basis for a marriage, but it enhances it greatly. Now, if you've been wondering why I'm hammering on this so much, and why I'm saying about God creating sex and having great sex and things like that, I want to take you back to Genesis chapter 2, verses 24 and 25. And I want you to listen to what it actually says. It's in the Garden of Eden before the fall. For this reason shall a man leave his father and mother, and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. Number one, to be joined to his wife. God established sex. Don't care how you put it, God created it. If sex is wrong, if sex is guilt-ridden in marriage, if sex is evil, then God is wrong, evil, and guilt-ridden. And I don't believe that. There's a lot of ways God could have established procreation. He could have said, touch your fingertips and she gets pregnant, or, kiss each other and a baby pops up in the next room, or whatever. God deliberately designed sex for human beings to be as it is. And that's something we don't think about a lot of times. That it's God's design. In addition to that, it talks about being one flesh. It's a special relationship that God has designed, and it's something that is beyond what we can comprehend. I will say this also. If you are unmarried, and even if you've had sex, you do not know what great sex is, I guarantee it. Because it is only within marriage that you can experience great sex. Because it's more than just a physical component. There's a linking of the flesh, and there's also a spiritual component to it that's indescribable. And also, if you look, the last phrase in this verse is, they were both naked and were not ashamed. God wasn't ashamed of sex. People weren't ashamed of sex when they were created. Adam and Eve were not ashamed to see each other naked. That was normal in the Garden of Eden. That was the way it was designed to be. We don't think about that a lot. Again, usually what we hear is, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And those are appropriate things not to do. But married sex is wonderful. It's that simple. And again, there's no prohibitions as far as what you want to do within marriage sex. I just recommend don't hurt each other, and definitely that you both consent to it, whatever you're doing. But God was not ashamed or embarrassed. You ever think about God looking down on you while a couple's having sex in marriage? God's not embarrassed by that. God designed it. If he was embarrassed, he wouldn't have designed it that way. In addition to that, if we go back to chapter 6, I want you to listen to this. In chapter 6, verse 15, it says, do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take away the members of Christ and make them members of a harlot? May it never be. He's talking about unmarried sex, going to a prostitute, and saying, you are linking to a prostitute. You're becoming one with her. Well, you know something? when married couples have sex, they're becoming one, not with a prostitute. In verse 15, it's talking about bringing the Holy Spirit into this relationship with a prostitute, which is bad. But you know something? When a married couple has sex and they are believers, they're actually bringing the Holy Spirit into that physical relationship as well. Now, this may sound strange to you, but people often talk about the Trinity, and they talk about 3 circles or an egg or all these illustrations. I actually think the best illustration, not that it's the same, the best illustration we have on earth of the Trinity is a married husband and wife having sex who are believers. The husband's there, the wife's there, and God is there. The Holy Spirit is in each one of those. And we saw the negative reference, but in the positive, God's there. God's not embarrassed by that. Again, this is something God created, and we can see that just by looking at this verse in Genesis. In the ideal situation, it's exactly what God wanted. Now let's look at the application a little bit. Number 1, should you stay single or should you get married? My recommendation is, obviously not everyone has the choice, but if you have a choice, only stay single if you really have the gift of singleness. If you are content without someone to live your life through with, and there are some people that are, if you're content and you're not sexually burning, then stay single because you'll have more opportunity to serve God. The point here is either is acceptable, stay single or get married, but immorality is not acceptable. And is it acceptable, for example, for a Christian man or a Christian woman to go visit another church because they'd like to meet other Christian men or women and try to see if they can find a mate? Yeah, that's fine. Now, if it's to the exclusion of serving God, that's another story. But again, the church is where you're supposed to meet people. The church is where you're supposed to get married. We don't want to send them out to bars to find people. It just doesn't work that way. But either is acceptable, single or married. The second thing I want to talk about is training, teaching, and sharing. Should be within the church. Premarital counseling. Excuse me. When Linda and I had premarital counseling, we had about 4 sessions, and we took every personality test imaginable, Myers-Briggs and all these other things, and everything else. And I was 35, and she was in her mid-30s also. And you know what never came up in any of the sessions at all? Sex. Never discussed. Never talked about. Nothing. Now, I'm not saying sex should be the heart of premarital counseling, but if you leave it out entirely, there's a problem. Something is wrong. Linda and I have now gone on and done premarital counseling with couples before they get married. We talk about sex, among other things. Obviously, we talk about a lot of other things, but we don't leave it out. As a matter of fact, if you go through premarital counseling with me, I have an option for all the guys to go through it. Not before 2 weeks before you're married, because I don't want you to learn about other things, but 2 weeks before you're married or less, we'll sit down and have a chat about anything you want to talk about. Because if we can help you to be a better husband in pleasing your wife, that's pleasing to God. And Linda has talked to women about that also. Not only that, in a couple of cases, I can think of cases where people just were totally clueless. Believe it or not, I gave them a little gift bag. Here, you're not going to know what you need. Take this on your honeymoon. You'll enjoy it. The point is that as a church, we should be encouraging couples in premarital counseling. Now, I'll say this. One thing I said clearly, I don't do this until minimum 2 weeks before the wedding. If someone comes to me who's a single person with no prospects of marriage and they're not ready to get married and they want to know how to have a better sex life, I'm going to tell them, we're not even going to discuss that. Because we're not out here in the church to arm people on how to have a better sex life who are not getting married. But if you're getting married, where else are they going to learn? And yes, you can go to books, etc. But the best way to find out is to talk to people who are married, who can help. And in addition to that, for married couples that are having trouble, for married couples that want to have a better intimacy with each other, married couples should be able to go to other people in the church and talk to them. It rarely happens. Rarely does it happen. But if you're a guy, seek out a guy that you can trust and talk to him. If you're a woman, seek out a woman that you can trust and talk to them. That's what the church is here for, and it's something we never discuss. But if you're married, certainly we should be able to talk about that. The church should portray married sex in a positive light. And we usually don't. We ignore it. We pretend that it'll just go away if we don't talk about it. The other thing I want to talk about is short-circuiting temptation. Sexual issues will cause temptation. It's that simple. Because of that, the more you look to please your spouse, the less the temptation will be effective when it comes. Now, I will also say sometimes in marriages there are physical issues. If medical help can help, go seek medical treatments. If not, talk to each other. The other thing I want to say here is, just because your spouse is not pleasing you in the ways you want to be pleased, in no way is that ever an excuse to seek sexual satisfaction with others, ever. Believers do not have that option, period. I can't make that any more clear. One guy that I know of who, frankly, shocked Linda and I by saying something to us out of the blue that we never expected to hear. I think it was because he was very old and forgot what he was saying. But I ended up with a great respect for him in one way. Actually mentioned to us how he had been married for 50 years or whatever and never been able to consummate his marriage. And it was due to physical issues with his wife where there was no possible way. Now, they did other things, but the point is that I had a great respect for him because what I realized was, you know something? This guy didn't go looking elsewhere. This guy didn't divorce his wife. Instead, he loved her so much that he worked with her. The point is, again, there is no excuse for ever going outside the marriage to find sexual satisfaction. But if you can please your partner, the more you can please your partner, the easier it's going to be for your partner to avoid that temptation. But don't ever take that as an excuse or a license. It's just not true. The last thing I want to say is, for an application, is God created sex and marriage. The entire design was from God. God is pleased when married couples are great sexually with each other. It's not an accident. He planned it all. I'm glad he planned it the way he did. He planned it for within marriage. But so often we have this idea that this is some strange thing and somehow it's evil or guilty or something like that. It ain't that way. Go back to Genesis. See how God originally set it up. And Adam and Eve were naked and not ashamed. And God saw them too. He wasn't ashamed of it either. It's by God's design within marriage. Now, I will admit again, this is probably the strangest sermon you'll hear in this church. But I felt like, number one, we're not going to avoid a passage because it might be a little bit uncomfortable. And number two, for too many centuries, the church has simply ignored the topic. And we can't ignore it because when we ignore it, all we're doing is telling all the people that are younger than us, go get your information from the secular sources, go to the schools, go to the bars, go to wherever. That's not how God designed it. Let's go ahead and pray.